And we are live. I'm here with Michael Lofton. How are you doing, Michael?
Good. How about yourself, David?
I'm pumped up and excited. I could barely sleep last night because I'm going to meet you.
Oh, well, I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
Don't get a big fat head because of me, but like we were talking about a little bit before we went live, there are very few people that are defending the living magisterium, warts and
Mm,
all, and we'll talk
mhm,
about that. We will get into that, but
mhm,
I'd like to start, as I always do, by having my guest go back in time, even before the age of reason, when you were very young. Your first notions that there's this God that created everything, and there's religion, there's a church, there's Christianity, there's this guy called Jesus who walked the earth 2000 plus years ago. You
mhm.
must have had some impression from relatives who were religious or just televangelists. What were some of those earliest recollections? What impression did it have on your young soul? And when you reached the age of reason, when did you first say yes to God and to Christ and His church?
Mm.
And just walk us through the dark times of puberty, if you had any, up to early adulthood, and then all the way up till today. Just touching on the highlights. And it's a big, big
Sure.
challenge, but everyone, all my guests, they rise to the occasion, and it's always interesting. So take it
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, well, see, I was born here in the United States in Louisiana, but really early on, we moved to Israel when I was 2 years old.
Mhm.
So my father was doing some missionary work there. And, so I had a little exposure to Christianity, but I was just too young to really understand any of it. We returned to the United States at the age of 4. My parents divorced, and then I began to live with my mom, who converted to Judaism. So started to have a little bit of a background there, but again, still too young to really understand any of it. At the age of 7, we returned back to Israel, but this time to begin practicing Judaism in the Holy Land. And that's when I actually started to um, learn a little bit about God as the head of the house at the age of 7. I had to do certain liturgical ceremonies in the Jewish tradition. I had to lead some of the ceremonies. So that was really the earliest memories I have of learning about God. But it was just mainly something that I was just told to do, so it wasn't out of conviction or anything like that. We loosely did that, and for a while, my mom did it, but then just kind of became nominal, and so we stopped practicing Judaism. And then we returned to the United States at the age of 12, where I began to move. At that point, I moved in with my father, and I began to learn about Christianity and really start to understand some of the very, very basics. And I became a Christian. I was baptized at the age of 12. And I, took Christianity seriously. But as I got into my teens and stuff like that, I started to move away from the faith. And so by the time I got into my early 20s, I wasn't living a really serious life. But at this time, I moved to New York City at the age of, I want to say 19, something like that. And, hit rock bottom at one point. I want to say around the age of 22. And it really forced me to start to look into um, God, Christianity, my faith. There was a catalyst for that, but a person handed me a Bible at that time, and I was so impressed by the fact that they gave me a Bible and actually cared enough about me to do something like that. And I was also kind of at the end of my end of the line, didn't really want to live at that point. So I just said, you know what? I have nothing to lose. Let me just go ahead and read this. And I read it cover to cover in little less than a month. And it profoundly changed my life. Ever since then, completely changed my life. And I can then talk about my story about how things progress from there. But I think you did also mention what were some of the earliest memories. I do remember again some of those liturgical celebrations in Judaism, and also I would remember I would often, just look outside my window, maybe around the age of 7 or so. I don't know, and think to myself, this could not have just come here from nowhere. It had to have come from a creator. And I remember being very convinced of that at a very, very early age.
Wow, so you
So
must have had quite a gardener to get that impression from looking out your window.
no, but just looking at and just seeing trees and just seeing things, I just thought this could not have come from nowhere. It had to have come from a creator. And there was just again this great conviction that was true, and I realized how absurd it would be that all of this came by chance.
What about devout family and friends, or even strangers? Like, what's the first time where you remember looking at another human being and saying, wow, you're tripping me out right now just by the fact that you seem to have a vertical dimension that no one else I've ever met has? How old were you? Like, you could have been in your early 20s when you had that experience, or it may never have happened
I
yet.
don't I don't know. I can't pinpoint a specific time.
Well,
Yeah.
just stare deeply into my eyes. Maybe you'll get the feeling. Kidding, kidding.
That'll work.
Kidding, kidding, kidding. I was going to ask you, the only question that I prepared for you actually was, it just occurred to me yesterday. I don't like to prepare for my interviews, but I did have one question that came to me. How
Mhm.
humble are you on a scale of 1 to 10?
I don't know. And I think if one were to even answer the question, it would put them already at, a 0.
Yeah, well, I
Right?
was
If you
thinking,
were to answer the question, wouldn't it put you at a 0?
it's a trick question. It is a trick question. But
Yeah.
what's the most humble answer? It's not 10, it's not 1, it's probably, is it 5? It's because this is the whole thing about self-awareness and the religious right, or what do you want to call it? Like, I'm holier than thou, and I'm very humble, and all these sorts of things. So maybe, like, if people ask me, for example, how intelligent do you think you are? I always say 5 out of 10, just because that's average, and it's a safe bet because the bell curve shape of most distributions in nature. Probably I'm in the middle. Let's just say 5. I think that's the best, safest guess. Is it the same thing in religion? Like, if someone says, how Catholic are you? How humble are you? How righteous are you? How holy are you? Is it safer to say 5 than 4 or 6? What's your hunch on this? Because it's very delicate, this whole
Yeah.
self-analysis.
I don't know. I think it's most prudent not to answer
I see.
such questions.
Okay. Okay.
I would rather let God determine the answer to that. I'm most concerned about what he thinks about me rather than what I think of my own alleged humility.
Have you ever been accused of being holy or humble?
I've been accused of being holier than thou excessively, even most recently.
Yeah.
Because on the channel, I'll mention that, hey, this is sinful, this is wrong. And people will say, oh, you're holier than thou.
No, but did anyone pay you a compliment that you didn't feel like you deserved, where they were sincerely saying that you're very holy and humble?
I don't know. I do feel that that does happen. I do feel that yeah, I would say yes. When I hear certain compliments, I kind of feel like, hmm, I tend to think a little differently.
It's difficult. It is difficult, being a public figure. Is that too much to say that you're a public figure?
I don't know. I don't know what really constitutes one.
Because this whole world of it's not televangelism, it's internet podcasting,
Hmm.
apologetics, whatever.
Yeah,
Are
right.
you a theologian? Are you what is the title that you're most comfortable with? Maybe you're not comfortable with any title.
Well, I do have a master's in theology, and I'm working on a doctorate in theology. Um, so I definitely do theology. I also do some apologetics. You know, and in fact, I would think the great majority of what I do on YouTube is theology and apologetics.
Okay, okay. And do you
Yeah.
have an emphasis? And forgive me for not doing my homework on you, but I never do homework on anyone. I prefer
No,
to
that's
just
okay.
have the discussion with a real human.
Sure, sure.
But what is the emphasis? Like, I sent you a long email with the sort of emphasis that I place in my tiny little apostolate
Hmm.
or whatever it is.
Sure.
What is the emphasis for you? Is it about, like today, is it about the living magisterium? Is it about theology? Is
Mm.
it about sorting out hairy controversies? Where do you think
Yeah.
the emphasis lies? Or is it just fighting off the rat
Yeah.
traps?
Well, see, they're all related. All of this is related, and it's all really goes back to the magisterium. Our understanding of it, whether we're in line with it, whether we're in dissent from it, whether or not it is actually authentic and has authority from Jesus, all of these questions. So I like to explore things that are related to the magisterium, but all those things really tie into it.
And what is a connection? Because my podcast, I've been doing it for 6 years. I'm very unsophisticated. I've dubbed my approach slopologetics because it's so sloppy. But the point is, what you see is what you get, and the things I'm thinking about, the things I'm worried about, they come through in every interview. Like today, I'm at a certain state of mind, and that's going to come across to you. And you might wonder, why am I focusing on this question or that question? It's because that's where I'm at, and I'm a little bit selfish and self-obsessed. So it's just all out there for everyone to see. Some people, if you watch their Catholic podcasts, you get the impression that they're very polished, and that if you saw them in their private life, they might have a different demeanor, a different attitude, they might have different emphasis, and that there's a lot there to discover that you're not getting to see on camera. Where do you fall on the spectrum between those two extremes, like me, a little autistic dweeb, and someone who's very polished and has a high production value and a lot of followers? Where are you on that spectrum, would you say?
Like, where am I in the spectrum of how I am on camera versus in real
How
life?
authentic are you? You come across as authentic. How authentic would you say your podcast is?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's how I am off camera. However, what would be a notable difference is I don't generally have a whole lot of interactions with people in theology locally, just because there's not a lot of Catholics. Now, I have in the past when I was Baptist and Presbyterian, there were plenty. In fact, most of my interaction was with people in person rather than online. But now it seems to be flip flop now that I'm Catholic and there's not a lot of Catholics nearby.
But the sort of the heart of the question I'm getting at here, excuse me, is in your walk with God, in your faith journey, you have crossroads, you have decisions to make, you have anxiety, you have doubts, you have fears, you have a struggle for virtue, you have all these things. Are you letting your audience know about any of that, or part of it, or just are you censoring yourself heavily on that, or are you open book and letting people know where you're at, or is that just completely irrelevant to the work that you're doing on your podcast? That's what I'm asking.
I think I'm an open book.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool. So I want to, thanks for sharing that, by the way. I just want to
Sure.
touch now on some topics that you brought up. You mentioned Israel and Judaism and then moving to the States. So I guess there's a separation or a divorce in your parents. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember what age that happened?
Around the age of 4.
Wow. And what's the sibling situation? Have you got siblings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We
Uh,
were separated kind of early on because I chose to move in with my dad and my sister remained with my mother.
and if anything's too personal, you just let me know, right? But what's the faith journey, roughly speaking, of your siblings? Did they go Christian, Jewish, atheist, agnostic? Are you able to talk about that a little bit?
I mean, I wouldn't mind. I just don't know if they would mind
I
me
see. Okay.
talking about
Okay.
them.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't mind though.
Okay.
But yeah, no,
Maybe better
I
not to.
tend to be the only one who is a Catholic, you know.
Okay. Okay.
All of my family, they tend to, well, there's a mixture, but they tend to be Protestant. So I'm
Okay.
the
Okay.
only oddball who chose to go the Catholic route.
Yeah. 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 Would you say that you're more religious than most of your family?
I think that there are some members of my family are pretty devout, but it's going to be more in a Protestant context.
Okay.
So it's going to look differently than somebody who is devout in a Catholic context. I think there's much more formality to Catholicism than there is Protestantism. So it's going to look different. But as far as intentions, I do think that there are some family members who are pretty devout.
And your friends, I don't know if you have a large group of friends or a small group of friends, but um, are they of all walks of life in terms of worldview? Or do you tend to, like, have you limited yourself where you prefer to be friends with Christians, or do you not discriminate in that way?
I've had all kinds of friends, but I've noticed that most people tend to move away from me when I became a Catholic. So,
Oh,
but I'm willing to um, interact with anyone, but I've noticed it's not always the reciprocated.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
In fact, a ton of friends cut me off when I became Catholic,
Oh, oh.
unfortunately.
So, I guess it's hard to know if, I guess we can consider that like a test of the friendship, just like traveling is a test of the friendship, and that you find out who your friends are. And I think COVID was a test for a lot of friendships too.
Yeah.
There's an
Yeah.
idea. There's an idea I like to play with, which is unity. You know, we have this idea of Christian unity, but just unity in general,
Mhm.
unity in the Platonic sense. In academia, for example, it seems like people can say, hey, I believe this, you believe that, this is excellent, we're on the same page. And there's a
Mhm.
sort of camaraderie. But then as your education advances in parallel, you specialize in this particular aspect of that discipline, whatever it might be. It might be literature, it might be
Mhm.
whatever. you and your friend find yourself diverging because you're forming all these specialized opinions. It's the same in religion. The more you look into religion, the more you start committing to these finer and finer branches. And then instead of being unified with your fellow Christians, suddenly you're in this narrow camp. So I want you to talk about that, because the idea of education bringing us closer to the one, to that one truth, it seems to be contradicted by our education system and specialization, and by the infighting in Christian communities and even within sects and branches
Mm.
of Catholicism. Can you just talk about that? And the reason I'm asking you is because I'm kind of desperate to figure out how we can come together and stop splintering and
Mm.
infighting. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's really easy to fall into a mentality where you become pretty exclusive the more you study theology and become committed to a particular position. I think it's important to keep in mind essentials, and also the context of the discussion. If I'm talking to just a Protestant, for instance, I'm going to really just limit myself to the bare bones essentials of Christianity. Whereas if unless there's a need for me to maybe challenge them or something like that, I'm not going to, however, seek to be divisive or exclusive with them. Um, but if I'm maybe interacting with a Catholic, I might be a little bit more, um, focused. I'm going to then focus more on the essentials of Catholicism. I might not necessarily nitpick some of the disagreements that we have that don't relate to the essentials of Catholicism. I'm not necessarily going to press those and try to make that a reason for us to not have a friendship or have interaction. Now, if somebody is, a Catholic and they're going against the essentials of Catholicism, yeah, I'm probably going to give them some pushback. But if we keep that in mind, however, what are the essentials, knowing what they are, and then, not letting the non essentials be deal breakers for friendship and interaction, I think that that will help us to be not as exclusive as sometimes we tend to be when we get really committed to specific positions.
Yeah, it sound like, from the sounds of it, it sounds like you're less antagonistic than I am. I called my podcast Catholic Versus because I'm seeking out differences, and my approach has always been a sort of three-step program where if someone's an atheist, I want
Mhm.
to ignore Catholicism, ignore Christianity,
Sure.
and I want to focus on the uncaused first cause,
Sure.
bring them to monotheism, classical theism. And then the
Exactly.
next step would to be to look at history and realize that the Messiah that everyone's talking about in Judaism and
Yeah.
Islam and Christianity is makes Christianity true. I think that's pretty
Sure.
clear and easy. And then the final step is authority. If someone's already a Christian but not a Catholic, to talk about authority. And I think
Yeah.
it's pretty easy to make that last step. Now, it's easy once you're in the Catholic Church, it's easy to see that framework. But there's something about the conversion process. It's not primarily intellectual, it's volitional. It's about the will. Do you have goodwill? Or, as St. Augustine said, there are two cities characterized by two loves: love of self unto contempt of God, or love of God unto contempt of self. So basically, it comes down to your will. Who do you love? What do you love? Do you love yourself or do you love God? And not to insult my separated brethren or non Christian monotheists or atheists or agnostics, but it's all about goodwill. That's the conclusion I've come to after 6 years of interviewing all kinds of people. I've interviewed over 200 people from various different worldviews. Do you agree with my
Mm.
general assessment there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I were talking to an atheist, I'm not really going to get into specifics on Catholicism unless they bring them up. I'm going to just start with more fundamental principles, and that is there a God, right? Is there a personal being who is a creator God? Start with those things, and then we can work our way up, like you noted. And same thing with a just a Protestant, somebody who doesn't believe Catholicism. I might not then start with theism, obviously, for them, but I do think that if I were in a position to be able to encourage them to look further, yeah, I'm going to go to the authority issue. That's exactly where I'm going. I'm making a beeline straight to that. So,
A quick little boasting opportunity here for you. Are you aware of having converted anyone to Catholicism or been instrumental, sorry, in that
sure.
process?
Yeah, yeah,
That's
and
pretty
and
cool.
you're right to phrase it that way. I mean, because it's ultimately God who convicts hearts. But sure, God does ordinarily use means and people to spread the message and things like that.
That's
So
pretty cool.
yeah, I usually get a comment daily,
Wow.
There's a lot of people who have come to the faith or
Wow.
have come back to Catholicism. Maybe they've left for Eastern Orthodoxy or something along those lines, and they've come back. So it,
Wow.
it it's those encouraging messages that help me to continue to do what I'm doing, because I get those, but for every one of those that I might get a day, I get 100 more negative people trashing the channel. So
What are the
it's
criticisms they have?
oh goodness, they're endless. A lot of them are lies. The spreading of lies. They've heard lies and they just try to level those against me. Um, a lot of them tend to be, straw man arguments rather than actually engaging the content. It's very conspicuous that the vast majority of them don't engage the content.
It's funny. Humans are very funny. What I've found, I mean, I'm just small
Sure.
potatoes in the podcasting world. Obviously, I do this part-time, I work full-time, but
Sure.
um, the characters that I really, really, really want to interview and that I want to talk with are the
Mhm.
cantankerous keyboard warriors who are hateful, and I really, really want to talk to them. And they never, ever accept my invitation. Never.
I'd like to see one of those interactions. If you ever get one, let me know. Send it to me. I'd like to watch
The
it. I
closest I
don't
got.
know. See, but is there really wisdom in interacting with some of these people? That's what I'm saying. It's just I feel that a lot of them are not good-willed. Now, if somebody has a disagreement but they're of goodwill, sure, I'll interact all day long.
Yeah.
That's fine. But a person who doesn't seem to have goodwill, I just don't know. I don't know if there's any wisdom to it.
Well, there's the wisdom of Christ that I want to be instrumental in
Sure.
imparting. That's the whole
Well,
point.
I understand that.
I really admire the grumpy, cranky God haters that do come on my show. One of my favorites is Aaron Ra. Do you know him?
I've heard the name, yeah.
He's
I
a
don't know if I've
big
ever sat down and watched any of his videos, but I
he's a
hear
big
about him
guy
a
with
lot.
long hair,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and he's quite a character. He's very cantankerous, very hateful towards religion. He was raised Mormon, which is
Ah,
what I call X factor atheism. It's
mhm,
atheistic, but with this all the Judeo-Christian natural virtues, they're
mm,
glomming onto that.
mm,
But anyway, he came on my podcast twice, and he's basically fell in love with the guy because he's so colorful. He's got a big heart. He's like a
mhm,
liberal, like a classic American liberal, just like
mhm,
he just a sweetheart that's misguided and naive
mhm.
about ultimate reality and can't think his way out of a paper bag, unfortunately, but very entertaining. And so that's why I'm interested in the grumpy keyboard warriors, because I think they have an innocence that
Ah.
Dr. Taylor Marshall, for example, would lack a certain innocence.
I don't know. I guess it depends on who we're talking about. I mean, because different people are different. I mean, I'm sure there are some who are cantankerous who are of goodwill and could be reached, but then again, in my experience, there's plenty of them that can't, and it's the latter that I'm just referring to. Um, but yeah, I imagine that there's some who are keyboard warriors who you could still reach.
They're just so shy. But what about a lot of these keyboard warriors, especially on the right wing? They're very hateful towards the Jews, and a lot of conspiracy
Mm,
theories about the Jews. And I've
yeah.
always over romanticized the Jews, even as an
Mhm,
atheist. I over romanticized the Jews. It's only recently that I started thinking, well, maybe what's up with the different taboos against like questioning anything to do with the Jews? Where I've started recently to think like that's maybe a red flag or an orange flag. But the Jews, I always love the idea that we are the how should I say, the non-Jewish dogs under the table of the Jews eating the crumbs, and that we are the wild olive branch grafted onto the natural cultivated olive tree that is the chosen people, and that Romans 11, there's a partial hardening for a time until the full number of the non-Jews come in, and then the Jews will come in. So my Catholicism is very, very Judeo-centric, and
mhm.
maybe too much so, but I don't think so. I want you to talk me off the ledge if I've gone too far in romanticizing it, but we are the younger son that's usurped the place of the eldest son, right?
We're definitely the younger son. I don't know if I'd use the term usurp. I don't know if that's exactly what Paul uses in Romans 9 through 11. He sees it more as engrafting into the
Yeah.
covenant. Um,
But we've got the pride of place now in the Catholic Church for sure. There's no comparison between modern day so-called Judaism and Catholicism. It's just like they
I
belong to a
think
false
that
religion, right?
I think that who has the pride of place is those who are in the new covenant, and that could be people who are ethnically Jewish or not. That
Of
is just
course,
anybody who's in the new covenant.
of course.
As far as the Jewish people, ethnically considered who are not in the new covenant, um, I do think that there's going to be a restoration of them in the eschaton, where they're going to be engrafted back into the church. Um, so, in fact, that's what we see there in Romans 11. So, God is not done with them. He's going to bring them into the covenant. And I think that a lot of people in Catholicism miss that. They miss the fact that God is not done with them. He is going to engraft them in. They're going to
Salvation
become Catholics.
salvation is from the Jews. What's that? Which book is that from?
Yeah, Roy Shulman. Well, you're talking about the Book of Romans, of course, but
Okay. Is that
yeah,
what
but
Paul says?
Roy Shulman. Mhm.
Does Paul explicitly say salvation is from the Jews?
Yes, he does.
Okay.
The Book of Romans.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
But
go
he
ahead.
also says other things too,
Yeah.
right? He
Yeah,
qualifies it a little bit more than that, right? But what he means by that is that the Messiah came from the Jewish people, and also they had the testimony of God, and so they were testifying to the one God, while the rest of us were pagans,
yeah.
and so the message of salvation has come through them.
What about I'm sorry for like I'm just treating you like I treat all my guests. So if you have areas
Sure,
of expertise that you really want to talk about, we can talk about them. But for now, I'm just going to freestyle. What about
sure.
Abraham as the father in the faith, our father in the faith? Um, like
Hmm.
from Adam to Abraham, that's one. Well, I guess Adam to Noah, Noah to Abraham, and then um,
Hmm.
I think it's that famous convert. Who's that guy from Franciscan Steubenville? Who's the guy, the famous convert?
Scott Hahn.
Yeah, Scott Hahn. He talks about the different covenants,
Hmm.
the Adamic covenant, all the way up to Jesus.
Hmm.
So these different sort of zones of time, um, the Jews they're just one of seven covenants? Is that the way we can think about it? Like there's a history, there's a salvation history prior to the formation of Israel and the Jews, right?
Hmm.
And
Oh yeah,
that's very significant, right? But what is
sure.
the point I'm making here is what's the connection between Abraham and Moses
Hmm. Hmm.
and the Jews? What is the connection? Can you just
Hmm.
complete that story for me?
Sure, yeah. So the Jewish people are going to come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God established a covenant with Abraham. It wasn't the first covenant. I mean, there was the Adamic covenant. There was the covenant with Noah prior to Abraham, and that was much broader in scope. But then there does become a more limited scope of a covenant in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we do see the Jewish people descending from that and carrying on that covenant unto the first century. And in the first century, it's Christ who is born, who fulfills the covenant that not only we have in Abraham, but also the Mosaic covenant. We would still say that covenant with Abraham, it's not like it's abolished. It's there. It's fulfilled in Christ. The new covenant is a fulfillment of such things.
So in your mind, not that it matters to pinpoint it, but what is the beginning of Judaism? Like, is there a tribe?
Mm.
Is there one tribe, the tribe of Judah, or is it all
Mm.
12 tribes, or like where would you put that beginning of
Yeah,
Judaism?
kind of depends on how we're defining terms. Um, I think Jews would certainly find their origins in
Okay.
Abraham. Now, Judaism, yeah, that is related to the tribe of Judah, but then there's some differences between that and what we see with modern day Judaisms. With modern day Judaisms, um, they are going to be something that is post destruction of the temple. It's going to be really a reformulation of Judaism as it was in the first century. So what we have in the first century with Judaism is not really what we have today. It has been reformulated because of the destruction of the temple. So what I see authentic Judaism as, in my opinion, is Christianity. Christianity is the fulfillment of those things.
Yeah.
I see modern Judaism as more of a deviation, of walking away from the ultimate roots of Judaism. That's just the position of the New Testament. There's
Yeah.
no way around that. Now, I'm not going to tell anybody how they should have their own religion or anything, but if we're just saying what is authentic to the message that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then also in the first century, I'm going to say Christianity. That is the fulfillment of these things,
Yeah.
not modern day Judaism.
I would agree 100%. What I was more getting at, and I'm hoping I'll drop the subject, but I just want to press you a little bit more. Abraham got the circumcision. That's a sign of, we could argue that's a sign that he was the father of the chosen people. But there were also branchings within the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So it's a hairy question. It's one that I guess we don't really need to answer, but would it be safe to say the circumcision is sort of like a sign of that's the beginning of the chosen people that were set apart and made holy by God? Is that a safe assessment?
I think circumcision in Abraham is certainly a sign of that covenant, and they're certainly chosen. Chosen for what is the question? Chosen to bring forth the Messiah. Yeah, I do think that is a sign that is really identified with Abraham. But then you'll note Paul talks about how Abraham was justified prior to the circumcision. So we have to keep in mind that, it's not like that mark somehow is what makes you part of the covenant. Because some people are going to say, okay, well, unless you have this, unless you're circumcised, unless you're keeping the law, you're not part of the covenant. And Paul's going to come and say, wait, Abraham was justified before the sign of the covenant. So as long as we keep that in mind, yeah, sure, I don't have a problem with somebody saying, well, yeah, that sign marks when that covenant began, but it's fulfilled in Christ. And the sign of the new covenant is baptism.
Absolutely. So, I'm completely on board with one of the early church fathers said that Judaism presupposes Christianity. It's
of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about the coming Messiah. They were prophesying the coming Messiah.
Sure.
So I often talk about Noah. I hated him when I was an atheist. I really hated him. People would accuse me of being an anti-Semite, and I'd say, no, I'm an anti-Noahite because I hate Noah. Now he's one of my favorites. I actually have an icon of him here. I don't know if you can see that.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. I like that icon.
But, the early church fathers talk about the ark, Noah's Ark, as one of the sort of types of the church. And this is a slam dunk for me in terms of the no salvation outside of the Catholic Church doctrine, which was reaffirmed at Vatican II, if I'm not mistaken, right? That's my reading anyway. So can you talk a little bit about the ark and no salvation outside of the ark, and how ecumenism works with that from your perspective and in your experience?
Yeah, there's a lot to this one. Yeah, a lot of ways we can go with it too. Well, I mean, look, in the same way that outside of the ark during the flood, there was no salvation. Likewise, it is with the church. There's only salvation in Christ and his church, the church is basically the extension of Christ in the incarnation. It's his mystical body. So we identify Christ with his church. So in the same way that there was only salvation in the ark and no salvation outside of it with the flood, likewise, we would say there's no salvation outside the church. Now, how does that work with ecumenism? Well, I mean, we could say that there's some people who are related to the church more than others. I mean, somebody who is baptized is much closer in relation to the covenant people of God in the church than somebody who is, an atheist who's never been baptized. In fact, we would even say somebody who has been baptized is partially in the church, but they only have a partial communion. It needs to be finalized with chrismation and Eucharist and a formal entrance into the church. So we can talk about, with ecumenism, people who are closer to us and others who are moved further away. But what we would say is, regardless, there's still only salvation in the church. Now, where it gets sticky is Somebody could be in the church, a member of the church, even though they haven't been formally received into the church. That's where it gets sticky. So we could say that there's somebody on the ark, even though they didn't formally come on board, if you will. We refer to these people sometimes as people who are in partial communion, but it's possible for them to have that interior disposition where they're united to Christ. They're in the church, but it hasn't been formalized. They haven't formally entered the church through its sacraments, especially chrismation and Eucharist. Maybe they've partially entered through baptism. And then again, maybe they haven't actually been baptized. It's possible for a person to have that desire for baptism and to be given the graces of it and that union that comes with Christ through baptism. It's possible for a person to have that even though they haven't received the sacrament yet.
What about the last breath, last microsecond of life where God intervenes? I'm not saying that God must or does, but it's possible that in some cases he might, because he wants all men to be saved. I've always preached on my channel that God has a plan for everyone, and that if your friend or your uncle or whoever, every indication is that they didn't die a happy death and they didn't enter the church, there's still that chance that God intervened in that quiet moment of death. And I have always emphasized the fact that if it worked, then that soul assented to all the Marian dogmas and the papacy, and they assented to all the Catholic stuff in that moment. And the way I think about it and the way I justify this radical belief, not saying it happens often, it might, I don't know, but I like to think so, but God only knows. But the way I justify this is because there's no contradiction possible amongst the blessed in heaven. They're not going to be sitting around having different opinions about Mariology or stuff like that. So you have to, it's just a matter of fact, we all have to get on the same page. Whatever the true worldview is, if it's Scientology, we're all going to be Scientologists in heaven. If it's Catholicism, we're all going to be Catholics in heaven. There should not be a controversial position, right?
Yeah, once a person is, reaches that state of the afterlife, I think they encounter the truth and they'll know. But prior to that, like in the moment of one's death, I think it's possible for a person to have that disposition of assent, even if they maybe didn't know that they need to be in union with the Pope or something like that. The question is, do they have that disposition to assent if they had known? So if they had known that they needed to be in communion with Christ's church through the papacy, would they have done so? If the answer is yes, then they are disposed to that. Even though it might not be explicit in their knowledge and awareness, it's implicit. There's that disposition that's implicit. I think that if a person has that disposition, God is not going to fault them for what they don't know, unless they were deliberately trying to be ignorant and keep themselves from the truth. That's something else. But if that ignorance is invincible and they are disposed in their heart to accept God's will, whatever his will is, if they knew God's will, would they have accepted it? If they have that disposition, can God work with that? Of course he can. But if somebody's closing themselves, off to God deliberately, either in knowledge of the truth or their will and disposition, they're like, no, I would not assent to God, even if I knew this was the truth. I would. Now that's something else. They're deliberately cutting themselves off from God at that point.
Yeah, well, I often say as a Catholic, I just went to confession today, and it's amazing. It's amazing. I'm going to have you talk about confession in a little bit, but right now I just want to talk about what was I talking about? Why did I bring this up with the confession? I'll come back to that. I wanted to ask you also, this is something controversial in the Catholic Church, which has to do with my friend Gideon Lazar. I don't know if you know him, the Byzantine Scotist. He did a little talk about predestination in the Catholic perspective, and I was a little bit surprised. And then I went and read in this book, which I've read multiple times. You've seen this before, right?
Mhm.
I
Yep.
read in there the dogma of predestination, that God has predestined some men
Mhm.
to heaven and some to rejection. Okay,
Mhm.
so there's a spectrum of interpretation that immediately
Mhm.
springs to mind for me as a non-theologian, non-expert. But you have a lot more education and experience, and you maybe have thought about this dogma of predestination and what it might mean. And you've had professors probably talk about it, and you've probably read a lot
Mhm.
about it. So I'd like to hear your perspective, and then find out how much wiggle room you have for, like, sort
Mhm.
of best case scenario, worst case scenario of how to interpret that.
Yeah, I've had some of the best scholars on in the area who've spoken about it at length. Um, I do believe it's dogmatic that God predestines
Yeah.
the saints because it's explicit in scripture. There's no way around that. It's just obvious in multiple places. Paul explicitly says that. So, of course, God predestines the saints. The question how does that work with free will, and how does that work with reprobation?
Yeah.
That's where the
That's where it gets
sticky
sticky.
part is, and that's where scripture might not necessarily be as explicit, right? So we do have to accept predestination, but a particular form of it, that's where we have some wiggle room. And so there's going to be some who say that um God actively damns the reprobate. I do believe that is not within the Catholic wiggle room. I don't think that that's a Catholic
So we're not
position.
Calvinists.
Yeah, I don't think that the Calvinist position, even though Calvinists might want to contend with that, what I just said there, and qualify it more, but I don't think that that's a legitimate option in Catholicism. Um, but what you will see is something a little bit different in Catholicism, where you would say that, okay, perhaps he's not actively damning the reprobate, but he's passively allowing for them to be damned. And that's more Aquinas's view. And
Okay.
then, somebody might ask, how does this work with free will? Some are of the opinion that, well, what it is God knows whether or not a person would accept the truth or not, and he predestines based on that foreknowledge. um, Others are going to want to push back on that, but I don't know how somebody could push back on that without ending up in an active reprobation position.
Mm.
So that's one of my concerns. So,
Mm.
but I mean, look, there's some incredible theologians out there who know way more about that subject than I, and have spent their entire life just working on it. So I'm happy to defer to the experts on that one.
What about St. Paul? It's pretty strong language when he says, "What if God wants to make certain
Yeah.
vessels for honor,
Yeah.
or some for
Right.
dishonor?"
Right.
That's
Right. Right.
strong.
Sure.
That's
Sure. Sure.
very
Sure. Sure.
strong.
Yeah. I mean, Romans 9 is incredibly strong. Um, Especially whenever he notes that, Jacob and Esau, he determines these things before either one of them are born. Um, and that's why some Calvinists will try to use that to promote their view. Um, However, I might still push back and say it's still possible, however, for God to, even prior to them being born, having done anything good or bad, to still predestine according to foreknowledge. Um, and so even that strong language, I don't think excludes a foreknowledge position. I don't see it. I see how it could lend itself to something stronger than that, but I don't see it as absolutely excluding any kind of foreknowledge position.
So it's very interesting in the Catholic Church. We always are going to have a tension,
Mhm.
free will and grace, and for the most part, I celebrate each and every tension that there is. Three persons, one Godhead. Whatever. I mean, all
Mhm.
of these tensions.
Sure.
I celebrate them because I celebrate mystery, and a tension for us, finite, dim-witted creatures. Attention for us is a sign that, oh, there's something transcendent here. There's something mystical or magical, or not magical, but mysterious.
I get what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
So we as Catholics tend to be a little bit more comfortable with the mystery. And I remember when I called into the atheist experience, Matt Dillahunty pretty much hung up on me as soon as I mentioned the word mystery, because he's like, "Oh, mystery, what is that?"
People excessively appeal to it, I guess. So he's just like, I guess, gun shy with.
But yeah, but the mystery of iniquity is another mystery that I'd like you to talk about if you can, because it's one of the most troubling things I've ever encountered in my life.
Yeah.
This idea that one of the brightest, most beautiful seraphim could
Yeah.
rebel. How do you
Right.
understand that?
Yeah, that's been one that I've thought about a fair amount. Not in any real academic way, but just something I personally have contemplated. The only answer I have for that is there's an imperfection in his knowledge. Otherwise, I can't account for. How is it that someone who knows this is the greatest good would choose something other than that greatest good? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless there's an imperfection in his knowledge. And I struggle to know how's that the case, given
Mm.
that even you and I know that God is the greatest good, but maybe we don't know it in the way that maybe an angel could potentially know those things. I mean,
But
we know that God is supposed to be the greatest good, but maybe there's an imperfection in his knowledge that makes him question that.
I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to know what the fathers of the church said about this question. I haven't read enough to
Mhm,
know.
mhm.
You probably don't remember, or you tell me right now, but I deliberately sin even though I know it's wrong, and I just say, well,
Of course.
I'm weak and I'm going to go to confession. Okay. So this is bad. I don't want to ever do that again. Okay. But
Yeah.
I mean, if I were a gambling man, I'd say probably I'm going to do it again. So,
Mhm,
but I don't want to. I made a
mhm,
firm resolve today not never to sin again, even venial sin.
mhm,
Okay.
mhm, mhm.
So it makes sense for me in this fallen world because I've got immediate pleasures, and I can just say, well, I don't want
Yeah.
to wait for heaven. I just want to have pleasure now. But
Sure.
Satan or Lucifer, whatever his name was when he was up in
Sure.
heaven, he had it. Did he have the beatific vision or no?
No, 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 no. He did not. And that's
Okay.
why he fell.
Okay.
But
Okay.
though he did not have the beatific vision, it's like, but
Yeah, the next
what
best thing.
would but yeah, exactly. And what would entice him away? It has to be some kind of imperfection in knowledge. When we go towards some good that is imperfect and um we sin, it's because we see some good in that sin. Um, so when he sins, he had to have seen some kind of good in something other than the greatest good. There had to be some kind of imperfection. For us, it might not always just be an imperfection in knowledge. It could be a weakness of the will and things like that. With Helm, he's not going to be subject to a body, and so it's going to be a little bit more complex. It has to be a defect in knowledge. Some might argue also it's a defect in his will, perhaps. I don't know. But that's what really is unexplainable to me.
Hmm.
How is it that he could know God, not in the beatific vision, but still know him in the way that he knew and still walk away from that? And not just him, but many of the fallen angels who went with him.
Bunch of followers.
And they don't have to deliberate. They don't have discursive reasoning
Right.
like we do. It's just immediate for them. So it's like that's one of the arguments for people who say that that's why they can't be redeemed.
Mm.
It's because their knowledge is already set. But it's like, okay, yeah, but sure, but knowledge can be communicated to an angel that can change their knowledge.
Mm.
So could there ever be any knowledge given to them that might change them? I don't take the position that any of them are ever going to be restored. So I'm going to say no.
Of course. Yeah, of course. We're not
Yeah.
allowed to say that. You remember when Satan said to Eve, "Ye shall not die if you eat of the fruit."
Mhm,
Scott Hahn said that was a threat, like meaning you better eat
mhm.
it, you better eat it, or you're gonna die. It
He said,
was a threat.
that God's words was the
No, no,
threat?
no. Satan,
Oh, I'm sorry, the Satan's
Satan
words.
coerced, bullied Eve into
Oh,
tasting the fruit. He said, "You will not die if you eat it," meaning you will
huh.
if you don't eat it. That's what
Yeah,
Scott
yeah.
Hahn said. Interesting. What do you think?
I haven't heard of that. I guess I'd have to think a little bit more about that. I wonder if there's anything in the Hebrew that would lend itself linguistically to
Uh-huh.
that.
Are you
I don't
opposed to
know.
the idea? Like, is it repugnant to you, that idea of bullying?
I don't know if I would exclude it.
Okay.
I don't know if I've seen enough evidence for that, but I do highly respect Scott Hahn.
Uh-huh.
So there has to be some merit to that position if
Uh-huh.
he put it forward.
And it's interesting. It's a very interesting take because he
Yeah.
said Adam, he was there. He was just sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
hiding, and
He was there.
he was not doing his duty as a husband
Yeah.
to protect his bride.
I agree
And
with
so
that.
he ties it all into this headship of the family, and it's all a very
Mhm.
macho interpretation of the fall. Macho in the good sense, I mean. But
Sure, sure.
but I am a young Earth creationist, and I love the proximity that I have to the garden. And if you believe in theistic evolution, I think it's philosophically untenable, and I think you're distancing yourself from that,
Mm.
and it gives you a certain cloud of like you can just have less pressure on you to pursue the good and these sorts of things.
Mm.
What's your take?
See, here's one thing that I don't know enough about science and things along those lines to weigh in either way. I tend to be agnostic on the question of theistic evolution versus young Earth creation. I'm open to either.
Okay.
Wherever the evidence leads. Here's my concern, however, is for those who take a hard stance, it would seem that you would have to have an incredible knowledge of science. And but I could be wrong on that. It just that's the impression that I get.
You don't need to know anything about natural science. You need to understand metaphysics. You need to understand the dogmas of the Catholic Church. You know, the
Mhm,
dogma that the soul is the form of the body. You know, we have the dogma
mhm.
of transubstantiation. So we have this hylomorphism. We have a
Sure.
dogma that God created a good world. We have all sorts of dogmas. The soul is the form of the body. Did I already say that one? Yeah.
Mhm,
There are many dogmas, and the most important one for me, the one that brought me into young Earth creationism, although I never believed in evolution, even as an atheist, I was
mhm.
agnostic about it. I just thought it was a stupid idea. Like, why would I say that I evolved from an ape? Why would anyone do that voluntarily? Um, the dogma that tipped me over the edge, and it was Father Chad Ripperger. I don't know if you know him or respect him, but he tends to be a little bit of a trad,
Mhm.
the
I know.
trads like him, but he tipped me over the edge by sort of paraphrasing Saint Maximilian Kolbe with the Immaculate Conception dogma that is the
Mhm,
slam dunk, because if Adam were conceived in any womb, he would have been conceived immaculately because he didn't sin obviously till he was formed, and so it would have been another immaculate conception. And the dogma says there is a unique privilege given to Mary. Now there have been people that say, well, there's pre-fall and post-fall, and there's a
mhm.
category error to apply this term immaculate conception to Adam and Eve, but that was what got me over the edge, and then I've discovered the metaphysical arguments for it. And Chad Ripperger does a good job of outlining the metaphysical principles
Mhm.
that are violated by any theory of evolution. So I'm 100% convinced, meaning 99.9 repeating, that young Earth creationism is the case. Evolution is false. But yeah. So any response to that?
Well, I think if the Catholic Church taught something that necessitates young Earth creationism, yeah, sure, I would accept that.
Oh yeah.
Bec-
Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah, because I trust the church's teaching authority better than I do my understanding of science and
Of course.
even the world's understanding of
Of
science.
course. Of course.
So if the church weighed in on it or has something that necessitates that position, I would go for it. I haven't seen that yet.
Does one position appeal to you more than the other? Do you secretly hope that evolution is true or that young Earth creationism is true?
I'm kind of
Meh,
indifferent.
meh.
Yeah, it really hasn't never been an interest of mine,
Okay.
to be honest.
What
Yeah.
about the rib Eve's having been formed from the
Mhm.
side of Adam? Do you know anything about the Magisterial Wake? Because that would be a slam dunk, right? If it were dogmatic.
I think that that would certainly lend itself, if we're going to see that as like literal,
Yeah.
I think it would certainly lend itself to theistic evolution.
Oh yeah.
I yeah,
Ah.
I think it would. I don't think it would necessitate the theistic
Ah.
of. I'm sorry, not theistic evolution. I'm so
Ah.
sorry.
Okay.
I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
I
Young
was like,
Earth
wow,
creation.
how did you come up with that? Wow.
Young Earth creation. I don't think it would.
Mental gymnastics
Yeah,
for
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
one.
I don't think it would necessitate young earth
Okay.
creationism, but I think it would lend itself to it very
Yeah.
strongly. But yeah, that's kind of where the debate is, right? I mean, how are we interpreting such things?
Yeah.
Is this something that literally happened historically, or is it something that symbolizes some truth, but it's not necessarily literalistic in nature? That's where the debate is. But I do think that if the magisterium were to come out and say this actually happened historically in the way that it's described, and it's not a symbol of something else, um, yeah, I mean, how does that not lend itself to theistic evolution?
Yeah. Do you know the Colby Center and Hugh
Mhm.
Owen? And all, do you have any
Well,
respect for them?
I know the Colby Center, but I don't know like really in depth
Okay.
about them. So you said
Hugh
Hugh Owen.
Hugh Owen.
Sounds familiar.
He's a
Have I had him on
very
the show?
dignified man. You should have him on your show for sure. You should
Have I had
definitely
him on?
reach out
Let's
to him.
see. Let me check because it seems like
He's
the
got a
name is ringing
beard.
a bell.
He's got a beard. He's a very holy, quiet, dignified man.
It,
Humble.
um, I
Byzantine right.
may have
Byzantine
had him
right.
on. Is he Byzantine, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if I met him the other day.
You
Actually,
should definitely reach out. His father was
Hugh
high up
Owen.
in Planned Parenthood. Can you believe it?
Wow.
And it was all about evolution, like evolution and eugenics and abortion. It's all tied together.
Why is it sounding familiar? Yes, I have had him on.
Okay.
I interviewed him. That's why it sounds familiar.
Okay.
I interviewed him a while back, but
Okay.
I've interviewed like several hundred people. That's why it's like I don't remember
Ah.
everybody anymore.
I wanted to ask you on a different side note, who are your top three favorite guests? And I don't want you to fall into favoritism and get in trouble.
Sure.
I don't want you to get in trouble, but just sort of
Yeah.
who left an impression, who's impacted you, who did you have good chemistry with? You just like the guy or gal? And what's the guy to gal ratio? Is it 90% guys?
Yeah, I would say probably 90% guys. I mean, and it's about 90% guys who are my viewers too. So it's kind of
Really?
proportionate. Yeah. It ranges between 80 to 90% guys who watch the channel. I don't know.
That's the way it is.
I don't have anything that would exclude women or
No,
anything,
no,
but I guess
all of us are in the same boat that are
yeah.
doing this stuff.
I guess men just tend to gravitate more towards the show. Um, yeah, good question. I don't know. I can maybe answer it this way. The first thing that comes to mind is an interview that I had that was very impactful on me, if that
Okay.
maybe
Yeah, yeah,
helps.
yeah.
I interviewed Mike Aquilina uh, on one of his books on the church fathers and friendship. And believe it or not,
Ah,
that one really impacted me because a
ah,
light bulb went off during that show for me. He was talking about how one of the reasons why the early church was so effective in evangelization is because of friendships. They would befriend pagans, they would befriend non-believers, and they were present to them as good witnesses. And that
ah.
converted people more than any kind of preaching and proclamation. Not that those things are bad, but it was, again, friendships and living as a Christian, being a good witness to them that really converted people. That profoundly impacted me. And I've tried to keep that in mind in preserving friendships and establishing friendships.
S-
Um, that was incredibly impactful on me. So that was like the first thing that came to mind when
That's
you asked me
cool.
that
That's very
question.
cool. I got some
Yeah.
follow-up questions.
Yeah, yeah.
Follow-up question number one.
Sure.
Will you be my friend?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
He even notes about how you want to have a friendship. Um, you can have a friendship with someone even just to be friends, not to try to evangelize them. Not that it's bad to call people to Christ, but in other words, he's saying it's okay to be friends with an atheist. It's okay to be friends with a non-Christian just for the sake of being friends, because friendship is a good in and of itself. That also was impactful for me because it lets me know, okay, it's not like I have to just be their friend so that I can evangelize them or convert them. I can be friends for the sake of being a friend.
It sounds very, very, very much like Pope Francis. That's the vibe I'm getting.
Mm.
It's like it's all about that relationship and
Yeah.
it's what do they call it? Accompaniment or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, that's a connection I haven't put together, but I think there's truth to what you're saying. Yeah.
That's one of the
I haven't
reasons I
looked
like
too,
Pope Francis, because he
yeah,
has that very simple
yeah,
love
practical.
of
Yeah,
people, and
sure.
he's the opposite of a rad trad.
That's true. That's very true.
And I dislike the rad trads, as you know. No offense, I met some sweet ones. I met some very good ones. I
There's
just,
some good ones. Yeah,
yeah, I just don't like the attitude. The stinking attitude.
sure. Yeah,
Um,
the distance.
do you
Yeah.
know the definition of the Catholic definition? I know it, but I want to know if you know it. The Catholic
The
definition of
Catholic
friendship.
definition of friendship. I don't know if I could specifically name a
Any hunch?
Catholic one, but I'm curious to
The
hear
Christian
what
one.
you
What
have.
would be what would be a Christian definition of friendship, just off the cuff?
I know it when I see it.
Well,
I would be pressed to give a definition for it, though. I'm curious, however, what's the definition that you have for it?
well, it sort of contradicts what you were saying, because it
Mhm.
says friendship is um, a friend is someone who
Mhm.
helps you to get to heaven. That's what a friend is. That's what I've heard from the
Now, I
saints.
have heard that before. Yes, I
The
have heard
saints
that
talk
before.
about this.
Yes.
So it seems to run against your idea, like, no, we don't need to. But who was it? Saint Francis of Assisi, who said, "Preach at all times and use words if necessary." So there might be that might be the workaround, where it's like it
Sure.
is, it's both. It's both, and like you don't need to
Both and.
preach. You preach with your friendship. The friendship is a
Yeah,
means to preach.
yeah. Like if you have an atheist friend, I do believe that a friendship is a good in and of itself. But if you have an opportunity to witness to this person, if you have an opportunity to bring them to God and you don't take that, yeah, that's not being a good friend.
Yeah,
That's not being a friend at all,
yeah.
because that's going against charity.
But there's so many opportunities to do it non-verbally. I think that's where we can have that
True.
5D chess thing, right? Where we have our cake and eat it too. I think Saint Augustine said that that definition. I'm a big, huge fan. That's how I became a Christian, was because of Saint Augustine. So
Mhm.
I'd like you to talk about Saint Augustine, what he means to you as a theologian and as a
Mm.
Christian, in your prayer life, in your theology. And then I'm going to ask you about a couple of other big name theologians and saints. So let's
Mhm.
start with Saint Augustine, please.
Augustine was actually pretty impactful in my life when I was still a Protestant, and helped push me in the direction of Catholicism. I I remember reading his Confessions
Yeah, that's what converted me.
when I was, yeah, still Protestant, and I was very impacted by that. I saw the warmth, the zeal, the passion, the love for
Mm.
God. That spoke volumes to me, and that will always stick in my mind when it comes to Augustine. So he's been pretty impactful there. I've also, of course, read some of his theological works, the Anti-Pelagian writings, some of the Anti-Donatist writings, some of his commentaries on Psalms and sermons and stuff like that. Now he has a ton of others, but those are some that I've looked into, and I've appreciated most of it. A few bits here and there, it's like, yeah, I don't know if the church would agree with that, but you know, not every saint says everything that, they're not always accurate on everything. Sometimes I feel Augustine is also a little too verbose. It's like he spends 1,000 words getting to somewhere that we could just say in 10 words.
Have you read The City of
But
God, though?
I've read parts of it, and every time I try to go through it, it's just like,
Oh my
yeah,
God.
you're really verbose here.
Tangent,
It's like the
tangent,
first, yeah,
tangent.
the first 10 books, it's like all about the Greek gods and stuff like
I
that, and
love
it's an
that. I love
apologetic.
that.
Yeah, but for me, it's like, I think we could have turned the city of God into like a fraction of this, you know?
Oh, I love it. I love it. What are some do you have any citations or quotes memorized from St. Augustine? Do any come to mind? I hate to put you on the spot, but it's fun.
Yeah, of course, the most famous one, which is probably the most meaningful to me, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Talking about God. That was a story of my life, because there was a lot of um a lack of peace and restlessness until I found God. That's why those words resonated with me more than probably anything I've ever heard from any other saint.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's chapter one. I pray the entire first chapter of the Confessions every day as
Oh,
part of
really?
my daily prayers. Yeah, it's short.
Is it from chapter 1?
It is from chapter one. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's been a while since I've read it, but that stood out with me. And actually, I don't know if you saw the Augustine movie, but they had that part quoted whenever he was being baptized.
Ah.
Yeah, they quoted that part.
Is it a recent contemporary production or old
Yeah, it was
movie?
probably done like 6, 7
Okay.
years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Well
in
done.
fact, they had actually it would have been a little longer than that because I remember they had a viewing for Pope Benedict. He watched it. I think it was well done. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, some of my favorite quotes for apologetics purposes from St. Augustine are Christians don't need the Bible. I love that one. We only need the supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and love.
Mm. Mhm.
I love that one. I love using that one against the Protestants.
Which one is that from? Which book?
I'll have to look up. I'll send you the link.
Sure.
The next one is equally powerful, and it's from his interactions with that guy. Who's that Gnostic guy that he was always fighting with? Do you remember? He was
Manichae?
Yeah. He wrote against him, against Manichae or whatever it was,
Mhm.
and he said, "I would not believe in the gospel were it not for the authority of the Catholic Church." I love using that
Mhm.
one with the non-Catholic Christians.
Mhm.
But there's so many colorful gems that he's given me, especially in the City of God. I love that quote that I gave you earlier about the two
Mhm.
cities characterized by two loves. That is so
Mhm.
powerful, and it's so spot on. Another one of my favorite saints I want you to talk about, if you know anything about him, and you probably do, is the second Saint Augustine. Do you know him?
Of Canterbury?
Yeah, Saint Anselm. No, Saint Anselm of Canterbury.
Oh, Anselm of
Yeah,
Canterbury.
he's called the second
Okay, I was
Augustine.
thinking of Dustin of Canterbury.
No, I don't know anything about him, and I'm not terribly interested
Oh,
what little I've read. But
gotcha.
Saint Anselm is called the second Augustine because
Hmm.
he sort of followed in the ideological footsteps. Have you
Mhm.
read his prayers and meditations or any of his philosophical works?
I tried to get through a little bit of it before, but I didn't complete. Now, of course, I've encountered when I've done
Yeah,
philosophy classes in school, I've
ontological argument.
encountered the ontological argument, which I didn't find very impressive at the time. Now,
Okay.
I understand that there's spin-offs and other versions of it, and maybe it's stronger than one initially
Uh,
expects, but I didn't find it to be too
uh,
terribly convincing. Now, in fact, curious thing is I just got it right over there. Came across some of his selected works that I just got at the bookstore the other day, and he has a
ah,
treatise on the filioque in there that I'm going to be reading. So, yeah,
ooh.
no,
Hi-
now I knew that he had that treatise. It's just I haven't read it yet.
Well, his best stuff, in my humble opinion, some of the most moving writing I've ever read are his prayers and meditations. If you haven't read them, I highly, highly, highly recommend you read
Seems
them.
like
Very touching,
somebody
very touching.
didn't Tan just publish those,
I don't know. I don't know.
or some of
Probably,
them at least? Seems
probably.
like they sent me a couple
It's
copies.
short. It's short. It's not long.
Yeah, I think they published it and sent it to me not long ago. I got a stack of just I got a
Your reading list.
huge library of books.
Is that a
That's
real
just
backdrop behiund you?
yeah, and there's
That's
a
real
lot
life.
more. Yeah, and there's a lot more books
It
around
stretches for
here.
miles.
There's a lot of books.
No,
It's
but
like I'm familiar with a lot of this stuff, but I haven't had the chance to read some of it. So.
so I just want to mention the reason that I'm so excited about Saint Anselm is because I was an atheist at one
Mhm,
point for 25 years, and when I was studying philosophy as a hobby, I went through
mhm,
chronologically from the pre-Socratics up till Descartes, and then I converted. But when I got to the 12th century or so, I read the ontological argument, and I chewed on that like a
mhm,
Zen koan for 8 years, and it was
mhm,
very instrumental in
mm.
bringing me to God. That and the Cloud of Unknowing. Do you know the Cloud of Unknowing?
I've heard it, but haven't read it. But yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The introduction of the book says, if you're not a Christian, don't read this book. And I'm like, but I want to read it. I want to read it. And I read it.
So read it anyway.
I read it anyway, and it did help. It did help. It did
Did
help.
it?
Yeah, it did.
That's cool.
It's a mystical thing.
Well, kind of like Thomas à Kempis. Uh,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I guess I
Yeah.
usually see him in that same
I love
category.
that. I love that.
Yeah.
I liked his first book. There's a sequel to that, Imitation of Christ. Do you ever read it? Something about a garden or something?
No, no, no,
No?
no. I'm not familiar.
I don't know if
I
it's a
know of the
fake. It
imitation.
might be
Yeah.
fake. It might be fake. I don't know.
I
Uh,
wasn't aware that there was a sequel to that. Huh.
yeah, I may have been fooled into buying it for my Kindle because I was disappointed when I read it. I'm like, this doesn't seem like the sequel to
Mm,
Imitation of
mm.
Christ. Now another one of my favorites. And do you have time? Do you mind if I keep you going? Do you have time?
Yeah, I got just a few more minutes and then I
Okay.
gotta head out. But yeah, just a
Okay.
few more.
Okay.
Sure.
Very briefly, then, talk about Saint Francis of Assisi and Blessed John Duns Scotus,
Hmm.
two that I admire a lot.
Hmm. Yeah, Francis, I can certainly appreciate him and his approach. I've been really impressed by his zeal and passion to preach the gospel. He goes out there, what was it, the Sultan? That he literally went to the Sultan to preach the gospel, knowing that he could get killed for it. That was pretty impressive. And of course, the stigmata. I mean, he's the first one to receive the stigmata. And I've always found that pretty fascinating. That testifies to his sanctity. So those are two things that really have stood out to me: his willingness to preach the gospel in spite of the fact that he knows he could easily get killed, and of course the stigmata. Um, Seems like I read his rule a while back too, and it certainly seemed to be a good rule. In fact, I was thinking of at one point becoming a third order Franciscan,
Ah,
but it didn't work out. I mean, I could have. It's just like, but there was a lot of other things I had going on, so I didn't pursue it.
you like Saint Francis de Sales?
Did he look into being third order but didn't do it?
I don't know.
Or you,
No, I'm
no,
just
no,
changing the subject here.
you're asking, do I like Saint Francis de Sales? Yeah. Um, One of his works. Trying to think of the title, but I'll recognize the picture as soon as I see it. It's not the spiritual combat. I know he didn't write that one, but it's usually in the same category. What's the one that I'm thinking of? The spiritual
Controversies.
work that he.
Oh,
Well, it's not the controversies. That one's going to be more of an apologetic, but
I liked his
it's
book
been
on the sign of the cross. Did you ever read?
Introduction to the Devout
Ah,
Life.
okay, okay, yeah, yeah.
That I remember that being a great book. It's been probably 10 years since I've read it, but it stands out in my mind as that was a really good work of his.
I'm reading the complete works. It's going to take me a long time of Saint Alphonsus Liguori. You like him?
I love Ligori. One of his best books that he wrote was on the Virgin Mary. Um,
Oh, the
and
Glories of Mary.
yes, and another huge one, Uniformity with God's Will.
Ah, Preparation for Death is amazing too.
And now I don't think I've read that one,
That's
but I've
amazing.
read over and over and over Uniformity with God's Will.
Did you read
That one's
Did you
awesome.
read the Philokalia of the Eastern Desert Fathers?
No, I do have the Philokalia, and I'm reading through it. And I have also read the Desert Fathers, the one that was published by, what's her name? Benedicta Ward, I think it's the one who put that one out. I've read that one, but the Philokalia is like pretty long, so I
Yeah,
haven't read it all
it took
yet.
me 11 months to read it. It took me 11 months to
Is
read
that
it.
right? Yeah, it's like 4 volumes, and there's actually a fifth volume that hasn't been
It's
released.
mostly
So
repetition, but
mhm.
it's a therapy.
Sure.
Saint John Vianney, you like him?
Yeah, now I'm trying to think, does he have any works?
I don't know.
Um,
I don't remember reading any of his stuff. I just
I don't
hear
think I've
stories of his
read.
life.
I've heard some stories, but I don't know. I'm trying to think if he has any books. I can't think of any. Let me look, see. I think so. I don't see anything coming up,
It's just
so I don't think
stories,
I've read any of
anecdotes,
his.
legends. Yeah. What about
No.
Saint Ignatius Loyola? You like him?
You know, I haven't looked too much into him. I do have a Jesuit friend priest who comes on the show and he talks about him a little bit. So, but
He's
I've never
cool.
really gotten into
He's
Saint
cool.
Ignatius of Loyola. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with him. I've never really looked a whole lot into the spiritual exercises or anything like that.
Well,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about the Jesuits next time if you'll come back. Now that we're
Yeah.
friends, I got you on tape saying you're my friend. So
Yeah.
if you come back, I'd love to talk about the conspiracy theories, the Black Legends. I'd like to talk to you about
Sure.
the glorious Inquisition and the glorious Crusades, and all that kind of
Oh,
stuff.
you know you need to get Steve Whitecomb on for the Crusades.
Oh, okay. Well,
He's an
now
expert in them.
now
Yeah.
that we're best friends, you should definitely send me like guests, okay? Because
Mhm.
I'm like a bottom feeder here on the internet, so I'll just take whoever you send me.
Steve Wyckoff is great and accessible. His emails online. If you
Okay,
email him, he'll most likely respond.
very cool. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope I didn't make you sweat too much with some weird questions.
No, you're
But
good.
I do hope you'll come back in all seriousness because I have a lot of questions to ask you, a lot of stuff to talk
Sure.
about. And I do really appreciate it. And I'll let you get back to your day. But I just ask you to pray for me and mine. And I enroll each and every one of my guests in a perpetual mass. Okay. So you're going to be getting
Thank you.
flooded with these extra graces
Thank you.
every day till the end of time. And it's for you and your family. So are you
Thank
married?
you. Yes.
Okay. Do you have any
Yes.
kids?
Yes.
Cool. So your spouse and kids and your parents and your siblings.
Thank you. I
So
appreciate that. We need it.
yeah, well, you're fighting the good fight there. And next time, I'd love to talk with you about Saint Paul. He's one of my heroes in the faith.
One
Amazing,
of my
amazing,
favorite in
amazing,
the New Testament era. One of my favorite. Yeah.
amazing. So God bless you and thank you very
Thank you.
much. And we'll talk very soon.
Thank you.
Take good
Take
care.
care. God bless. Bye bye.
Bye.